When we first arrived in Istanbul, we had planned a 3-hour drive to our first stop. This turned into 6.5 long hours on the road. I would love to say that we learned from this mistake, but we went on to make a ton more throughout our Turkey road trip adventure. But that's not to say we didn't have an incredible time. Turkey is an amazing country to explore with a unique mix of natural beauty, historic monuments, ancient cities, and fun nightlife scattered throughout the countryside. But the mistake we made along the way cost us time, and we missed out on a few destinations due to our lack of preparation. This is where I hope this video helps you prepare your own itinerary so that you can learn from our mistakes and get the absolute best out of your Turkey road trip. We decided to hit the road immediately and save Istanbul for the end of our trip. Our plan was to drive west towards the Gallipoli Peninsula, head down the coast from there, and make up our itinerary as we went along. So the first tip I need to give you at this point is to get a SIM card at the airport for your navigation before you go anywhere. Wi-Fi is hard to access in some places, and English is not widely spoken. We wasted a lot of time over the first 2 days on this point alone. We didn't arrive at our accommodation until 2 a.m. And while we were relieved to arrive finally, the biggest wrong turn was waiting for us the next morning. You know when you think you may have taken a wrong turn and your gut is telling you to turn around, but you're in denial thinking, I'll just go around this one corner and I'll be exactly where I expected to be. Well, I was in denial for far too long on this drive, and what was supposed to be an easy 15-minute drive turned into a 90-minute stuff-up where we drove through farmland, lots of sunflower fields, almost running over a snake that was longer than the width of that road you see in front of you, and finally hitting a complete dead end and having to turn around and go back through it all again. But eventually we did make it to ANZAC Cove, and I was immediately struck by just how nice the water looked and how peaceful the surrounding area was. Now, in case you can't tell already from my accent, I'm from Australia, so visiting this site was a special moment for me personally and something I'd wanted to do since I was a kid. I'm conscious that most of you watching are from other countries around the globe, and I was also travelling with An, who grew up in North Vietnam, a place with a very different kind of military history that they teach in schools. So I'll try and briefly explain the significance of Gallipoli the same way I explained it to her that day. I also want to be as respectful of the site as possible, so I won't show much video footage of the area, and I'll just leave this message from the Turkish people up on screen while I give this explanation. As I walked around the various memorials and cemeteries, I realised that the majority of men who fell here were far younger than I am, with many never making it to their mid-20s. And it may have only been my good fortune to have been born 100 years later that determined just how different our lives were, even though we grew up in the same places and may have been similar people in a lot of ways. And that's what's so confronting about coming to Gallipoli. It forces you to confront the question that if I was faced with the same circumstances, would I have had the courage to do what these men did? Am I capable of charging up a beach or out of a trench directly into machine gun fire, shoulder to shoulder with my mates? That's a question I cannot even begin to answer, and thanks to the sacrifice of these men who lay here, and thousands of others all around the world, I never have to. And that's a question that anyone can relate to no matter where you're from. Every country has their own significant military history that has directly affected what their lives look like today. And that's what I think a visit to Gallipoli is all about. A combination of that self-reflection and deep appreciation of those who have come before you, no matter where you live. This is what the road is supposed to look like. So if, like me, you end up on a narrow dirt road, turn around, go back, and look for something like this. Now, me being the slow learner that I am, it wasn't the last of our wrong turns for the day. As we headed down the coast towards the ferry that would take us across the water to Cannakale, I drove straight past the ferry terminal and we wasted yet another half an hour driving down the coast and back up again. Let's buy a map. It's really hard to explain to someone who doesn't know the word map that you need a map, especially when you're holding a map.
Showing them.
Now, it's even harder to say, this is a Europe car one, we can't read it, it makes no sense. I'm like holding up a map, saying, do you sell maps? Map. the driving, playing charades with the driving thing. They look at us like,
Taxi?
taxi? No. So our first stop when we finally arrived in Cannakale was to get a damn SIM card so we had navigation. From Cannakale, it's not much further down the road to the ancient city of Troy, but because we had lost so much time during the day, we decided to skip past that one. As much as I love the movie and the story of the Trojan War, the actual Trojan horse on site is not the original, so I didn't feel too bad about skipping past this one. So we pushed on and covered the 4-hour drive to the city of Izmir. Our main reason for coming here was to explore the ancient Roman city of Ephesus. But we would spend the night in the city and have some time in the morning to explore. But before we could relax for the day, there were 3 things that made our arrival in Izmir memorable. The first was that our new access to navigation apps proved almost useless. There were so many one-way streets that the app just didn't recognise, which made it extraordinarily difficult to find the right street for our hotel. The second was the coolest set of traffic lights that I've ever seen, which we found on one of our many laps trying to find that hotel. And the third was that when we found the right street, it was virtually a parking lot, and the concierge came out encouraging us to just leave the car in the middle of the road and give him the keys. By that point, I was happy to leave the car behind. We'd spent far more hours in there today than we had planned, and we were both looking forward to exploring Izmir on foot first thing in the morning. Konak Square and the Izmir Clock Tower is a great place to start exploring the city. From there, you can either venture towards the waterfront, where there's lots of great restaurants, or head towards the surrounding commercial areas, where you will find street after street of Western-style retail outlets with very reasonable prices, alongside more bazaar-style marketplaces, with the best known being the Kemeralty Market. The waterfront promenade is a popular fishing spot, and it would be a nice place to hang out if it were not for the horrendous wind that we experienced that day. We actually really enjoyed walking around Izmir, and we found it to be a very welcoming place. The locals were very friendly and accommodating. If we had more time, we would have loved to have done a day trip out to Alicante, which is about a 45-minute drive away. But instead, we were headed in the opposite direction to the Ephesus Archeological Museum, and we were really excited for this one. Rookie error. Come into Ephesus, it's 36 degrees, no hat, no sunscreen. I'm still pretty white. I feel like I've tanned up so far on this trip, but I'm still pretty white, and I'm going to get burnt as fuck. Wish me luck. You can help me feel much better about all that sunburn by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel if you're enjoying the video so far. As you walk around Ephesus, you get a great feel for what life was really like here 2,000 years ago. At one end, you have the well-known landmarks like the Marble Road, the Library of Celsus, and the Grand Theatre, which at one stage could hold up to 25,000 people. And at the other end of the complex, you have the State Agora, the Fountain of Pollio, and a much smaller theatre. But my favourite place in the whole complex was the road that linked these two areas together, which is called Curates Street. Sitting at one end of this street, in an elevated position looking back down towards the Library of Celsus, allows you to really picture what life was like here all those years ago. The road itself is very well preserved and largely unchanged, with a lot of the main sites you want to explore on either side of this road. Heracles Gate, the Temple of Hadrian, and the hillside houses are all found alongside this thoroughfare. We have a full video going into more detail on our trip to Ephesus, and we'll leave a link to that in the description. After some brief souvenir shopping, we were on our way to Pamukkale. Most people come to this town to visit the thermal baths, but a quick word of warning if you're planning on staying in the city is that when booking accommodation, make sure you read the fine print. The hotel that we stayed in had a special condition that if you didn't turn up by 7 PM to check in, they could give your room away to somebody else. Considering we were on the road until late, that's exactly what they did. So after some robust discussion at reception, they did manage to find us another room, but we could very easily have been stuck with nowhere to go. I have never come across this anywhere else in the world, but it seems to be reasonably common in Pamukkale, so just be wary of your check-in time when you're making your reservation. Now, on to the thermal baths themselves. This is one of the most uniquely photogenic places you'll find in all of Turkey, and it really is a beautiful place that just jumps off the screen when you first discover it online. But did the experience live up to our expectations? Well, not really, and there's a few reasons why. The first being that the temperature of the water was surprisingly cold. The hot springs are only at the top and bottom of the complex, with everything in between fairly cold. We were there first thing in the morning and were surprised by how chilly the pools were. The second thing was just how uncomfortable it was almost everywhere you went. The surface is very rocky, it can be sharp in places, it's a little bit slippery, and you can bet that any time you've seen someone posing for a photo on the water's edge, chances are they're extremely uncomfortable. But it is still a beautiful place, and the mountains way off in the distance I thought was a really nice backdrop to the surroundings. Nearby, you'll also find the ancient ruins of Hierapolis with an incredibly well-preserved grand theatre. You can also go for a dip in Cleopatra's antique pool. Both are worth exploring when you're in town. When deciding where to go next, this was another case of us not really thinking through our itinerary before getting started. We really wanted to go to Fethiye and do the coastal drive all the way along the peninsula to Antalya, but we weren't sure if we were going to have enough time to squeeze it in. So we decided to skip that and go directly to Antalya, which in hindsight I really regret. I wish we had the extra day or two to take our time on that coastal drive and explore everything along the way. The one activity I really wanted to do that we missed out on was taking the cable car to the top of Mount Antalya just outside the town of Olympos. I'll add this to the list of things to do next time I come to Turkey, and by the end of this video, you'll see it's a pretty long list. All throughout Turkey, you come across these imitation police cars just on the side of the road. During the day, they're pretty easy to spot, but at night time, the lights on top are lit up just like a police car that you can see way off in the distance, so it does make you slow down. And occasionally, there's a real police car there, so be careful. Now, onwards to Antalya. This was another city that was an absolute nightmare using the navigation apps. The number of one-way streets that weren't recognised sent us round and round the city centre looking for the entrance into the old town so we could get to our hotel. Once we did find it, we were faced with some of the narrowest streets I have ever driven down, and I was just as worried about hitting a shopfront as I was hitting a pedestrian stepping out of one of the doorways. But it was as funny as it was dangerous, and eventually we found a spot to park the car just near our hotel, and from there we could explore on foot, which was much easier. This was one of our favourite stops on our road trip, with the old town being such an amazing place to explore, with the narrow winding streets full of restaurants, bars and interesting shopping. There are lots of charming Ottoman era houses with ancient landmarks scattered throughout, with some of the best known spots being the Herdelik Tower, Hadrian's Gate and the 13th century Yevliminari Mosque. The waterfront area with the old city walls surrounding it is a really beautiful place. But it's at night time that Antalya really comes alive. You'll find street after street of outdoor dining areas with lots of fresh seafood, live music and bars where you can hang out until the early hours. It's a really fun city and a highly recommended stop on your Turkey road trip. And before you leave, make sure you spend some time outside of the old town city limits and check out the Duden waterfalls. There is a beautiful park that follows the waterway all the way to the point where it cascades over the cliff tops into the Mediterranean Sea. Back on the road again, and we had the longest drive of the trip so far to do the 7-hour drive to Cappadocia. This is, of course, the town made famous by the hot air balloons that decorate the sky every morning in this amazing desert valley. But more on that shortly. First of all, we had to get out of Antalya, and as you can see, I was still having a little trouble with the local traffic lights. Waiting. My neck is getting sore. Come on.
Should I just wait to get beeped? Hey! As soon as I took my eyes off, we're good.
From all of the driving we'd done so far, The scenery around the roads was mostly uninspiring except for the occasional glimpse of the sea. But this drive was very different. We were headed inland and away from the coastal areas, so I didn't expect too much, but the landscape changed from forest to mountains to desert over the course of a few hours, and it was a really interesting drive. And as we got closer to the town of Goreme, we started to see some of those very unique rocky monuments sticking out of the ground that are the signature of this region. Speaking of rocky monuments, a lot of these are actually hotels. And I would absolutely encourage you to stay in a cave hotel so you get the full Cappadocia experience, with one caveat. Make sure it has air conditioning. Ours did not, and it was like sleeping in an oven. But it was lower budget hostel style accommodation, and we set up our beds in a small isolated cave area with no ventilation, so probably not the smartest move on our part.
Welcome to our new home.
But it was still a very unique place to stay. And the best part was on the top floor was a large platform overlooking the whole town and would be the perfect spot to see the hot air balloons floating around on our second morning in town. But our first morning we plan on being on one of those hot air balloons. So it's an early night because we start at 4 AM. So we're here on what looks like an absolutely glorious day in Cappadocia. But unfortunately for us, way up high, even though there's not a cloud in the sky, is a little bit too much wind for the hot air balloons. Now, this happens from time to time, not much we can do about it, but to make things worse, they're saying that tomorrow is also cancelled, and some people are saying it'll be out of action for the rest of the week. Some people are saying just for the next couple of days. So we're due to fly out tomorrow. So now we're facing a bit of a decision whether we skip out on the flight tomorrow and book one for the day after and hope we can get in on the third morning. That's a pretty big if at this stage. So unfortunately for us, this bucket list item is going to have to wait until another day. But there were still plenty of things for us to do around the area so we could make the most of our time here, with our first stop being the fairy chimneys. The chimneys themselves are the result of volcanic activity and erosion over thousands of years. But what makes this network of mushroom-shaped structures so interesting are the handmade caves that have turned these mushrooms into a small village, and you can walk in and out of what appeared to be old houses, storerooms, or general gathering areas. It's a fun place to explore and a real window into a different time. We then jumped in the car for a quick 10-minute drive to one of the more romantic destinations, Love Valley. I don't know why they didn't just call it the Valley of Dicks. Yep, so we got long and thin, we have short and fat.
Which one's yours?
Mine. Where's the biggest? Now there are two ways you can enjoy Love Valley. The first is quick and easy. There's a car park right next to the viewing area where there's a number of great vantage points that offer views all the way across the valley. The second is long and difficult, but of course much more rewarding and immersive, and that is hiking all the way through the valley. It's about a 3 or 4 hour hike, and if you're going to attempt this, I encourage you to start early because that desert sun gets really hot. If you're willing to venture a little further away, you could also explore the underground cities of Cannakale and Derinkuyu. These were originally built to protect locals from foreign invasion, and you could hide up to 3,500 people at Cannakale and 20,000 people at Derinkuyu, which is simply extraordinary. When you consider they also had to take livestock in there, I cringe at what the living conditions would have been like at the time, but it's a fascinating place to explore. You can easily fit all of these activities into a day, and so we were left with another decision to make. Do we wait around for another day and hope we can get a spot on one of the hot air balloons? Or do we head back to Istanbul and try and get another day there? On balance, it was unlikely we'd get a spot on the hot air balloon, and if we did wait that long, we might miss out on Istanbul altogether. So we made the tough decision to book a flight back to Istanbul that night and get out of there. Yet another activity that has to go on our list of items to do next time we come back to Turkey. And while you can't do much about the weather, I'd encourage you to include a few extra days when planning your Turkey itinerary so that if you need some flexibility to make sure you get your balloon ride, you've got that built in. So after nearly a week on the road, we'd covered over 2,000 kilometres. So we had an ambitious itinerary and we had to skip over a few things that we'd love to see one day in the future. But for now, we get an extra day in Istanbul, which is an amazing city to explore and it really deserves its own video. So click on the screen now to continue with our Turkey adventure.